Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us today. I am Joey Andrew Santos, and I'm going to be your moderator for the session. Before we proceed to today's talk, I would like to make some reminders. First, please ensure that you use the name that you registered with us. Second, please keep your microphone on mute to avoid any unnecessary noise that may affect the session. Third, if you wish to interact with the speaker, you may do so by clicking the raise your hand option, and I would then acknowledge you and have you unmute your microphone. And lastly, if you're quite shy to ask your question, there's nothing to worry. Just feel free to send your questions to the chat box, and I'll be happy to read them for you. Once again, everyone, welcome to our talk for today. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has not only taken many lives, but also steered the socio-political climate around the world and posed challenges on education, more specifically in the humanities. The relevance of the humanities in confronting the pandemic has been in question, which leads to putting a pause or much worse, halting humanities programs in different parts of the world. This raises questions among scholars. For instance, the Humanities and Social Sciences Department of the Washington University St. Louis ventures on how the humanities can reshape individuals' self-awareness, shared sense of purpose, and to have a sharper recognition of their vital connections. Today, we are joined by an esteemed speaker who will share with us the COVID-19 and the Plagued Humanities Crisis, deep times reflections on literature, race, and critical race theory. To formally start today's talk, let's welcome the Associate Dean for Internationalization and Organizational Image Enhancement for her welcome message and to introduce our speaker. Please welcome Assistant Professor Dr. Nirada Chitrakara.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at our 5th International Arts Talk. The purpose of our talk is to invite international speakers to join us and share with us their ideas towards language and culture. And we'll have different guests joining us. And sometimes they can be from foreign countries. And we are also planning to feature our own lecturers too. So for today, I'm very proud to introduce Professor Gregory Rutledge, who is my good friend. I knew him since a long time ago during my time in University of Wisconsin-Madison. He and his wife, Jong-im, were the only two literature people that I knew. And we became friends since then. And after Wisconsin, Professor Rutledge moved on to work at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And there he became now the associate professor. And he has a few works published: Futurist Fiction and Fantasy, The Racial Establishment, Speaking in Tongues, an interview with science fiction writer Nalo Hopkinson, and his book, the latest one, right? The Epic Trickster. Professor Rutledge is an expert in ethnic studies. And today he will share with us his reflection on his efforts to use human as subject for literary studies of race, exceptionalism, law, and literature during the time when race is a sensitive issue. And the study of humanities, especially literary study, is plummeting in America. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Greg Rutledge.
Good morning to you all, and thank you, Narada, for that very warm introduction. It's truly a marvel to be able to have this talk with you, and it shows the possibilities of our technology for connecting our world and making us really have the ability to have small communities and to reach across vast differences. So part of my talk today, in fact, is about the possibilities that we now have for reconfiguring the humanities and dealing with questions that we've not dealt with before. It really is a pleasure for me to be the fifth speaker in this series, and I'd like to thank the University of Chulalongkorn for this opportunity, the International Arts Talk series that has been organized by my very good friend, Dr. Narada, also by Dean, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Suradet Cho Dampant,
Yes.
and also, very good, and also, of course, PhD candidate Joey Santos, who has been very indispensable in helping me get to this point as well. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to those of you who are participating in this. I look forward to speaking to you and hearing your questions. Part of this talk is, again, to reach out and to use the technology avenues that we now have to address the kind of crisis that COVID has exposed about our understanding of the human in the world, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen with you so we can go ahead and get started. So this is the guiding question for the talk there at the top. What is the human, the face of the human, the place of the human in the humanities? And when I reference the humanities, I'm really speaking about the Western humanities that has been in place for the last several centuries and how that dominates the way that we understand the world. And it's a very important question because much of the Western hegemony means that this perspective on the human is broadcast to other parts of the world as well. When I speak of humanity, on the left, I am referring to this global sense of the human that I hope to invoke and tell you about in the talk, as distinguished from, on the right, the Western lowercase humanities. And I'm going to use a shorthand and say manatees throughout the talk, because much of the patriarchy and the dominance of the heteronormative male is about masculinity. It is about the man. And so that's really shaping how the humanities are being performed here in the United States. With a world-leading death count of more than 500,000 plus, approaching 600,000 from countless places inside of its walls, this talk about the human, capital H, and its differences with the humanities, or the manatees I told you about, in the long 2020. And what I mean is from the fall of 2019 to this present moment. Of the United States has a face and a place. It is the face and place of two interlocked pandemics, the face of police brutality and the place where COVID-19 first had its outbreak in the United States. In the midst of this, I found myself in the most peculiar moment as a participant observer beset by a bewildering barrage of faces and places. As a participant victim of the racial drama, I was witness at the same time. I was tasked with being a neutral academic observer. The year was 2020, brought to us multiple times daily by the modern day technology of Trump's Twitter account, brought to us by the US's unresolved issues of the past that were crowding into the moment. The national riots of 2020 brought back the atmosphere of 1960s race riots all over again. And so you see in the upper left-hand corner, that's George Floyd, that's 2020. The upper middle, this is the LA riots of the mid-1960s. The anti-immigrant nativism resembled the US's post-World War I laws passed in the early 1920s to stop Eastern European war refugees from entering the country and prevent interracial relationships. And that post-World War period was also the last pandemic that we had in the world, which is the flu pandemic that killed millions of people around the world. Trump's anti-China rhetoric resembled the 1880s exclusion law that barred Chinese from entering the country. Some elected officials, U.S. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, spoke favorably of slavery as a, quote, necessary evil, which took us back to pre-1861 America, before the Civil War. Many Trump supporters, like the Proud Boys, Three Percenters, and Oath Keepers, all far-right groups, were trying to spark a civil war. They wore Nazi paraphernalia, 1930s and 1940s, and carried the South's Confederate flag, 1861, 1865, and American Revolution flags, 1776. The January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol was in revolutionary fervor. And yet, many of them were believers in QAnon theory, which is about baby stealers, deep state, and believe it or not, Trump as a savior of all things. So it is pure science fiction and fantasy mashed together with politics, religion, and technology in this incredible mix that perhaps no one can really pull apart. This happened, a national crisis we had never before encountered, as our civil rights leaders of the 1960s were dying, leaving us at the very moment we needed them to provide not leadership, but stability and continuity. So imagine, if you will, those people who were really towering figures who helped to guide us to the civil rights that we have right now, and to see them dying in significant numbers at this very moment. So it really brings to bear the kind of crisis feeling that many people had, including myself. In other words, I was in an impossible situation. Trained as a lawyer and then a literary scholar, where I met Narada, I teach in the humanities, and was witness to truly barbaric inhumanity in the world's so-called greatest democracy and most advanced country. Much of literary criticism relies upon study of past literature to unlock irony. Now, irony is a way that authors use their knowledge of language, of words, of definitions, and the histories of those words to be able to put meaning beneath the surface of the plot or the obvious themes. Authors use irony for two primary objectives beyond the entertainment function of a reader's surprising journey of discovery. One, to teach us how to read, not just text, but the layering of our reality, an important educational tool since elites prefer simplistic education to keep the masses in the dark. And related to the power of elites, a second reason irony is used is to evade speaking too plainly and drawing upon oneself the wrath of the state. In the 19th century, for example, when we had slavery here, and there were those slaves who wrote their own autobiographies, it was incredibly dangerous for them because they oftentimes are writing about their specific experiences and specific names and specific places and dates so that they could attack the institution of slavery. Well, the very wealthy slaveholders were sending out slave catchers and even assassins. So there was fear that by writing your autobiography, you could be assassinated no matter where you were in the country. So it was a very extreme risk. Because I know that literature can be deadly even in a supposed democracy, I reject modern trends in literary criticism that really foreground the idea of theory to an extreme degree, which makes it very difficult for us to talk about things such as race, and politics and history and philosophy and religion, and how all of them are connected in a very material way that defines the lives of all the people here in the United States and arguably people in our world. Toni Morrison wrote a very famous essay about this phenomenon of what happened after the 1960s, when the changes in the US curriculum brought about people who were in the Black arts movement and who were pursuing civil rights, had the first African Americans arriving in the universities, and also the first time that African American literature began to be taught. And Toni Morrison noted that at that very moment, theory, and really high theory, started to a very large degree, which meant that race became much more difficult to talk about. And so Morrison asked, why is it that then race began to disappear? And so it's very hard to talk about it. So what this means is that I work hard to save, yes, save, students, undergraduate students and graduate students, English majors and non-majors, from the society and still modern habit of reading stories for pleasure. Society says repeatedly, you are literate, civilized, smart, read fast, consume much, enjoy everything, and don't overthink. The epitome of this is the idea of the speed reader, those for whom advanced meaning simply flows in at warp speed. As a high school student, I recall fetishizing the smartness of those who could read and consume at hyperspeed. At about this time, Bill Cosby, then a beloved comedian who earned a doctorate in education, now he's a convicted serial rapist, was promoting speed reading technique. This is the issue of the Rolling Stone magazine in which you find that article. In How to Read Faster, Cosby says, there are common sense practical ways to get the meaning from printed words quickly and efficiently. So you'll have time to enjoy your comic books, have a good laugh with Mark Twain, or a good cry with War and Peace. Ready? And later he says, most of us learn to read by looking at each word in a sentence, one at a time, like this. My brother Russell thinks monsters. You probably still read this way sometimes, especially when the words are difficult or when words have an extra special meaning, as in a poem, a Shakespearean play, or a contract. And that's okay. But word by word reading is a rotten way to read faster. It actually cuts down on your speed. In 1986, I did not know of speed culture, the performance-enhancing and dietary drugs that had become an epidemic among white middle-class US households in the 1940s. The Nazis used them, speed, Pervitin specifically, at the start of World War II. And then the Allies adopted the same strategy. Germany stopped because of the extreme side effects, but the US kept using them for military and domestic purposes. US soldiers were given speed during the 1951-1953 Korean War. My wife, a South Korean, now rethinks legendary stories about the unbelievable energy of US soldiers in Korea. By 1986, there was a war of drugs raging in the US, and a new human lived around me. Now, in the mid-1980s, there was a world of racially coded drugs that Reagan targeted for his war on drugs. And this had very severe impacts on the African American community because the change in the laws targeting African Americans in particular occurred at the time when urban poverty really began to grow to an extreme, as many of the factory jobs began to go overseas, and jobs that had been held by African Americans simply disappeared within a generation or two. So this was an additional attack in addition to what had already been taking place. So imagine that you have this war on drugs, you have this deep set of poverty, and then you have Bill Cosby promoting speed, reading Twain for a good laugh. Now, this is enough to make you sick right from the start. Twain, whose latter years were devoted to anti-US imperialism and critique of the Gilded Age, and the Gilded Age is Twain's term for the vast accumulation of wealth. And it goes from the 1870s into the 1929 period when we had the stock market crash here in the United States. So Twain used comedy to mask his very deadly serious irony. Again, irony being the way that you can code meaning beneath the surface. The message of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is that Americans enjoy action adventure too much, enjoy laughter too much, enjoy Christian dogma too much, enjoy gold too much, and think far, far too little, or not at all. My close reading approach means setting aside this kind of fairy tale reading and indoctrination, which is based on very simplistic and intentionally wrong assumptions about what a human is. Cosby was actually teaching us how to skim, and that's okay, but he was misleading those minority kids like me who really needed word-by-word reading to seek the author's intentions through irony, to read their world and find deeper satisfaction of the universal human story. This is a human story that I never saw asked or answered in all the news coverage of 2020. How did minority scholars like me, whose expertise was minority studies like mine, who were trained in law like me, who lived in a conservative state as I do, and who specifically meditated on American exceptionalism in the humanities, the manatees, like me, feel and think about this moment of 2020? I began my graduate school career as an anti-racist with a specific focus on Afro-speculative literature, science fiction by African Americans. But when I realized that the mythical drivers of racism were largely ignored by the civil rights establishment and humanities, manatees, academics, it was like a cancer undiagnosed and untreated. My own studies, my own focus began to shift. And I asked questions like, what is heroic epic performance culture? Are all heroic epic performance cultures identical? How does epic relate to racism and exceptionalism? As a result of these questions, I have become more than an anti-racist. I become first and foremost an anti-exceptionalist. In recent years, my research into epic and exceptionalism moved from academic arts and letters to the very personal. Donald Trump's Make America Great Again policy became a broad cultural practice in 2000 and 2017, of course. Now, I teach African American literature with epic exceptionalism as my frame. So you can imagine how surreal this felt, the MAGA policy. Every 4 years, as we near a presidential election, my class looms even more significant as the nation's political mythology, rooted in the American Revolution as the epic, featuring George Washington as the epic hero, reforms itself. Again, every 4 years when we have these kinds of presidential elections, it is an opportunity to re-invoke the presence of George Washington. Here are a few of the syllabi that I've used, and the two on the right represent what I was using in 2020. And on the far right is my critical race theory syllabus, the front page of it. I was teaching my course in critical race theory, the understanding by legal scholars beginning in the 1980s that narrative studies could expose the master narrative of racism in the law. One of the novels that I used during that semester is this one, The Marrow of Tradition, published in 1901 and written by this biracial figure, Charles W. Chestnut. And it's about a coup d'etat that actually happened in the state of North Carolina in 1898, in which the democratically elected government, which was biracial, was overthrown by a junta of 9 businessmen who used their economic and political influence and the media to generate a great deal of white supremacist anger and resentment that then was directed against the biracial government, which was toppled in a very violent event. So as I was reading, I felt that the Marrow tradition was again returning to our society, that the prospects of a coup was coming around again. And then on September 19th of last year, news broke that President Trump was specifically targeting critical race theory, banning its teaching among federal employees. Suddenly, I was partially, but with very real implications for myself, an enemy of the state. So imagine if he had won. It was a very clear signal that critical race theory was probably going to be a very risky thing for people to teach. Now, I was vindicated and horrified by the fact that the cautionary principle of my epic performance studies was being proven all too true. In the epic trickster in American literature, From Sunyata to Soul, this is my book, instead of focusing on racism and trying to build up African-American literary culture to prove that our literature was worthy, which is a classical civil rights approach, I constructed a comparative storytelling model situated on 3 facts. Excuse me. Of course, epic-oriented cultures exist worldwide, including in Africa, all throughout Africa. 2, those societies are diverse, humans are equal. And 3, depending on the culture, heroic epics can be great literature and extremely dangerous cultural forms. Instead of relying upon a European American model of the humanities, the manatees, to prove African American epics worthy of being included in the canon, I turned to anthropology and then found the human of what Princeton scholar Y.T. Dimmock famously called deep time. And deep time for her is literally how literary traditions go all the way back to the earliest societies. And so she thinks of American literature not as a product of political developments and economic developments from the 18th century onward, but of forms that come all the way from Persia, from China, from the Middle East, that then impinge on what we call American literature to now. And she is even thinking beyond, say, 3,005 or 5,000 years ago. She's thinking really in terms of 100,000 years or more, and what the human is coming forward, the storytelling capacity that then ends up being literature. These epic cultures have their own logics, their own faces, heroes, and places, but they can come into contact with one another. And then what? It's epic wars of the irresistible force of Greece versus the impregnable walls of Troy, the classic Homer epic, and World War I and World War II, modern events that reveal the horrific danger of hero worship to many pro-epic Western intellectuals. Literally, World War I and World War II shocked a lot of the people who believe very much in the heroic model of humanity. The Western educational matrix, dominated by classically trained elites, has, not surprisingly, omitted this form of education in recent decades. Anthropology, once a tool of 19th century colonialism, became the bane, the curse, the enemy of Western pedagogy when contemporary scholars begin to compare US and Western cultures to the rest of the world. Hence, anti-racist struggle in the US concentrated on racism while ignoring epic performance and myth as a generative cultural phenomenon that lies at the center of American exceptionalism. Sadly, and most tragically, there are too many African American intellectuals who are against racism, but they nevertheless embrace the logic of individual exceptionalism. And you can see some of this if you know about the post-World War II, post-colonial history of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where many of the freedom fighters then turned around and became dictators all throughout the continent. So they then were using their own exceptionalism to then dominate and become very destructive forces. So I'm very much against this kind of exceptionalism because it's just lurking there as a real danger. Now, the brute face of police brutality for the long 2020, again, from fall 2019 to present, is, of course, George Floyd, his death under the knee of Derek Chauvin for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, a torture videotape that was made viral and then global. His face is the uprising face of 2020. But I don't mean when I reference a face, Mr. Floyd, nor do I mean the face of an inspiration for hashtag say her name, Breonna Taylor, the Louisville, Kentucky emergency room technician, a saver of lives, who was killed in a hail of bullets when police wrongfully executed a no-knock warrant and entered her apartment after 12 a.m. She was struck by 5 bullets and killed. And I think the police fired a total of 32. George Floyd and Breonna Taylor will not be forgotten. There are or will be news segments, memes, graffiti art, tattoos, shirts, posters, mugs, student papers, scholarly articles, conference panels, social science and criminal justice studies, books, songs, memorials, and maybe even documentaries. A Hollywood biopic or two. And certainly we have the trial right now to really reinforce all of this. And that is the reason why neither George Floyd nor Breonna Taylor is the face for this talk. Their posthumous celebrity is the reason. Their fame is not of their choosing, and both would have chosen life over this American celebrity, of course. But the elevation of their deaths is inseparable from that which literally plagues the nation. Hero worship, even in the form of martyrdom. The nation of Black Lives Matter protesters were far less inclined to be outraged over the separation and detention of children belonging to families who were seeking asylum in the United States. And this is one of the things that really gave me a lot of grief during 2020, to see that there was not the kind of outpouring for what was happening to so many children who were separated from their parents. And to me, that is a real reflection on how all Americans, not just white Americans, but Black Americans, Asian Americans, Latina Americans, how there's a definition of the human that really guides the way that we interact with one another in this world. Instead of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that face for me is that of Elijah McClain, soft-spoken Elijah Jovan McClain, a 23-year-old man of delicate frame and facial features. His death occurred months before George Floyd's, but only received national attention after Floyd's death. He had never been arrested or ever been in trouble. He played the violin and guitar. A massage therapist, he had gone to the convenience store in Aurora, Colorado to buy an iced tea for his brother. Just after 10:30 p.m. on August 24th, 2019, the Aurora, Colorado Police Department received a call about a, quote, suspicious person wearing a mask and waving his hands. He was wearing an open-faced mask, his sister said, because he has anemia. His blood is a bit thin, so he gets cold rather easily. They dispatched 3 officers, Nathan Woodyard, Jason Rosenblatt, and Randy Rodema. They confronted him. 3 days later, his body was brain dead. He was removed from life support. Now, we saw Elijah McClain's story on the June 29th, 2020 episode of Democracy Now! And I'm going to show you some of that coverage that we saw.
Easily. Police body camera footage, a warning this footage we're showing contains disturbing scenes, shows 3 Aurora police officers answering the call, attempting to handcuff Elijah McClain. He was unarmed, had committed no crime, was simply walking home. After one officer grabbed him by the arms, Elijah said, quote, "I'm an introvert. Please respect the boundaries that I am speaking. Leave me alone." Despite this, the officers then used a chokehold that's since been banned to bring McClain to the ground. In body camera footage of the encounter, McClain can be heard saying the same words George Floyd and Eric Garner uttered in their final moments, "I can't breathe." Again, a warning to our audience. The following video contains disturbing footage of police violence.
Fighting us in the ground.
My name's Elijah McClain.
Yeah,
That's
but
all.
I'm ready to use carotid.
That's what I was doing. I was just going home. Why? I'm an introvert and I'm different.
You come out?
No.
Was he out?
Yeah.
I heard some snoring.
I just
He
don't
wasn't
like
completely.
going
He didn't lose
home.
consciousness.
I'm just different. I'm just different. That's all. That's all I was doing.
It was actually Rosenberg.
I'm so sorry.
You're done, dude.
I have no gun.
That's why I tried carotid.
I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting.
Other units that are not here.
Why were you telling me? I don't lose guns. I don't even kill flies. I don't eat meat. I'm not a vegetarian. I don't judge people.
No, I
for any.
Medical responders soon arrived on the scene and injected Elijah McClain with ketamine, a kind of anesthetic. For someone the size of 300 pounds, he is 140 pounds. He suffered a cardiac arrest on the way to hospital, died several days later. Footage from the night of Elijah.
Remember, in contrast to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, a small man, a mere 140 pounds. We will return to Elijah McClain, but I'll leave you with this for now. He is the face of the human, not of the manatees, the humanities. Place. Seattle, Washington, the 135th Annual Modern Language Association Convention from January 9th to 12th, 2020 is the place. You may know it as a site where, in the United States, the first large-scale outbreak of the coronavirus occurred. Yes, I was there, along with my family, as the deadliest pandemic the nation has seen since 1918, the world has seen, was silently working its way through the public spaces hundreds of thousands of people frequented. Upon leaving Seattle for 3 weeks, I actually had a persistent digestive problem that, in retrospect, makes me wonder, could I possibly have contracted the coronavirus and not have known? Of course, I was not tested until just rather recently, so it is entirely possible. But this is not about me. On the morning of On the morning of Friday, January the 10th, I and my family attended the Modern Language Association Conference's signature event, a presidential plenary forum presided over by Simon Gikandi, the Princeton University scholar and MLA president. It addressed the topic on being human. This is how the program described the plenary. Once thought settled after the end of the Cold War, the question of human rights has returned as a major concern of writers, intellectuals, and activists. On this panel, leading writers, scholars, and teachers reflect on what being human and claiming rights means for their work, their institutions, and constituencies today. Who determines who has rights in a world that is defined by complexity and multiplicity? Although not referring to Donald Trump, everyone knew. It also featured Charles Johnson, the famous writer, Gayatri Spivak, an eminent post-colonial theorist, Jennifer M.B. Wallace, a Cambridge University scholar, and Viet Thanh Nguyen, the scholar of Asian American literature and cultural studies, who is a sympathizer, won the Pulitzer Prize and almost every other major US literary award. I list Nguyen last, even though he was introduced before Jennifer Wallace, because of what happened before this plenary on being human. I was making my way toward the entrance, the flow of bodies converging on the two-story escalator. My wife and son were not with me, as I went early to secure seating for us. As I walked toward the escalator, I caught sight of someone who, looked like Nguyen, walking a few feet ahead of me. He was not alone. A little boy, perhaps 8 years old, was with him. When I reached the top of the escalator, the entrance to the conference room was controlled by a middle-aged white woman who checked credentials and handbags. When the man who looked like Nguyen arrived before her, seeking to enter with his son, she refused. No young children under a certain age. But, you see, the man was Nguyen. Nguyen registering the moment, the irony of the Humanities rules in a society of extreme imperialistic violence explained. And I'm kind of paraphrasing here. I'm one of the plenary speakers, he said, incredulously, his implication being, surely, ma'am, you recognize that your rule is utter nonsense in this case. I, of course, was in agreement. His son would not be alone, for his father would be there a few feet away. My immediate second thought, as other manatee scholars strolled by, was to intervene as a father, as a scholar of minority studies, as a human who should. But a third thought detained me. If I come to his aid, would I be contributing to his feelings that he was an incompetent other, capital O, who needed help? With Nguyen and the MLA's manatee's guardian at an impasse, I chose silence and entered. Moments later, my wife and son joined me, as did, to my relief, Wynn and his son, maybe even a little earlier. Perhaps among all the panelists, Wynn gave the most insightful and interesting address. He did discuss topics about ethnicity, sexuality, and literature while using comedy and frank language that was mature and explicit. But I understand his thinking, why he wished his son to be there, and he brought his son with him. My son needs to know this now as a matter of knowledge and life, is humanity. Wynn is someone who is thinking outside of the manatees frame, as he indicated in a 2017 interview in response to the question, given this back and forth process that you had between fiction and criticism, did you find that your process of working on the academic book informed the novel and vice versa? And this is how he responded. I was completely moved by writing The Sympathizer, just the process of it. Writing Nothing Ever Dies, the book he was working on, I was also moved. I thought that was really crucial because I wanted to enjoy the writing experience, and I felt that I wanted to also move my readers. More than just intellectually, I wanted to move my readers emotionally. That was a huge lesson that I took out of writing fiction, that I could use the transformative power of language to shift my scholarship. I felt that if I wrote the right way, I could speak to a lot of people who cared about this topic, who weren't just academics. I run into so many of them on the book tour for The Sympathizer, and talking to all those people confirms what I already suspected or knew, which is that there are a lot of intelligent people who are not in academia who care about these things. I think I did accomplish that with Nothing Ever Dies, judging from the reviews that we've gotten so far, almost all of which are not by academics, but are probably librarians for the most part and book reviewers. Wynn, who is thinking beyond just academics and the humanities, did not speak about what happened at the entrance to the plenary session, though I half expected he would. I had a notion to write a column exploring the problem, but I didn't. But that fleeting moment, a passing exchange on the threshold of the plenary session conference room, never left me. If George Floyd is the public face of police brutality in 2020, the space of the presidential plenary on being human at the Seattle MLA convention is side of what I call the plagued humanities. There, at the outbreak of COVID-19 in the US, was a space where the plagued humanities, started to haunt me. Eminent scholar Michel Foucault begins his essay on panopticism about the use of surveillance discipline in the prison industrial complex in a way that is truly disturbing and applicable to this moment. This is what he wrote. The following, according to an order published at the end of the 17th century, were the measures to be taken when the plague appeared in town. First, a strict spatial partitioning, the closing of the town and its outlying districts, a prohibition to leave the town on pain of death. Each street is placed under the authority of a syndic who keeps it under surveillance. If he leaves the street, he will be condemned to death. I underscore these key words: order, plague, partitioning, death, authority, and surveillance, because they represent these key words that define the infrastructure of the present moment in the United States and throughout much of the West. Now, we have in some ways moved beyond this because this form of control is so entrenched that some scholars think that we're no longer in the mode of disciplining people, but we've internalized it so much that now we are willingly performing the kinds of disciplines that Foucault had talked about, and so we live in a different order of existence. In the West, this is not surprising, this reference to panopticism as the infrastructure of our reality, since humanities is a word is etymologically rooted, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, in classical Latin humanitate, humanitas, where it means human nature or character, civilization, culture, humane character, kindness, human feeling. And this sounds quite benign, but it is impossible to forget that Latin was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire, and its humanites certainly did not include the human, capital H, barbarians it conquered around the world. Imperial humanites is a blueprint for Western universities. Britain's rulers, according to MIT historian Craig Stephen Wilder, learned the strategic value of academies. And thus, Oxford, Cambridge, and other medieval and early modern universities had been swept upon into the religious and political conflicts that gave birth to Great Britain. Not surprisingly, Wilder notes in Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities, and he speaks mostly about the Ivy League. Quote, the first 5 colleges in the British American colonies, Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, Codrington, and New Jersey, were instruments of Christian expansionism, weapons for the conquest of indigenous peoples, and major beneficiaries of the African slave trade and slavery, end quote. It is well known that the colonization was a double-edged plague for first Americans, the Native Americans here. Enslavement on a massive scale and an actual plague, smallpox, unleashed on them with devastating effect. What is the manatees in higher education? Again, we all know what the canonized humanities means by the process of default and association. This is Rimbaud's point in A New History of the Humanities, the search for principles and patterns from antiquity to the present, a 2013 Oxford University Press publication. It's the first book to attempt an, quote, overarching history of the humanities in the English language, end quote. Bold asks, what are the humanities? It is like the notion of time in St. Augustine. If you don't ask, we know, but if you ask, we are left empty-handed. Bold's exhaustive history covers antiquity, the Middle Ages, early modern period, and the modern manatees, and Western Europe primarily, China, India, Arabia, and Africa in great detail. His is a scholarly history of the eminent thinkers who use methodological rigor, while defining the manatees from the perspective of mere praxis as study primarily associated with philosophy, literature, history, music, and of course the classics. Bold prefers to define the manatees as scholarly, theoretical thought. Quote, I want to stress, perhaps unnecessarily, that a history of the humanities is not about the history of music, art, or literature, but about the history of musicology, art theory, and literary theory, end quote. In his treatment of modernity, Bold castigates the ubiquitous racism of the new humanities that arose in the 19th century when modern historiography expanded to reveal a host of splits and tensions. In light of the vast expansion of historical methods, Bold asks, quote, how can we explain such enormous fragmentation? Perhaps the answer lies in the diversity of past reality too immense to take in, end quote. The invocation of diversity demarcates the bias to Bode's study. He implies the existence of multiple or diverse humans, I argue, because one, he never describes the way that is historical scholars define the human, as if it were the same among all of them. Two, he makes no effort to define the human for his study. And most importantly, number three, he omits discussion of how the East African origin of modern humans impacts how the humanities defines itself. In the chapter from which this quote comes, the last one on the screen right there, Bode references Africa's unique orality-based historiography, its methodological diversity, but leaves other, capital O, knowledge of human origins unenlightened, untapped, unmentioned. Indeed, by acknowledging the legitimacy of African orality, as Bode does, he establishes a foundation useful for recognizing the oral humanities that defines the past for the entire world, and a truly enlightening comparative humanities. But this foundation goes unrealized since Bode historicizes scholarly institutional humanities, written methodological, while denying the existence of its referent, the human, which he does not define. I can speak for myself in saying that except for this general knowledge gleaned from education over my lifespan, I have never, ever studied the human, capital T, capital H. Yes, I learned of Neanderthals and the Ice Age, Stone, Bronze, Iron Ages, hunter-gatherers, cradle of civilization, Egyptian papyrus, ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, of course, DNA, RNA, world wars, and so on. Of course, we all did. But I mean real, rigorous, sustained study of the common modern human. Has anyone ever done this anywhere in the Western humanities in the world? The pillar of tradition of the humanities, rest upon the deep belief in the smartness of the professors or lecturers, the faith that it is pure pursuit of knowledge, and the conviction that its place in progress has been ordained as the human order. Ironically, Oxford University figures prominently. It published Bode's book, as I mentioned before, but just 1 year earlier, it published E.J. Michael Witzel's The Origins of the World's Mythologies, 2012. In seeking the very beginning of the world's myths, Witzel, who's a Harvard professor emeritus, studied how the human should be studied, how it should be approached, beginning with the idea that humans originated out of East Africa about 200,000 years ago. And he uses the idea of what they call the African Eve, the very first ancestor of us all, to begin tracing mythology. So he shows how the human should be studied and what the humanities should reckon with. And of course, we don't know if this is going to be the right configuration because his is just one study and there are no others to really replicate and demonstrate whether he's right or not. But his is, I think, a very, very sound first effort. Now, this is Oxford University, the publisher of these two books. It's the oldest of the universities in our modern West. Tradition, right? Like the British royal family, a centuries-old tradition that, as you know, with perhaps the Oprah and the Meghan Markle bombshell interview, reveals that the royal family has its own tradition of deep-seated racism, right? Very complex thing. What do we know of the real origin of their royalty? Go back far enough in Britain or any society, and the roots of royal blood will be exposed. The actual, probably bloody authoritarian origin is lost in the past, where myth, spirituality, Hobbesian law, in other words, might makes right, and human culture intertwine as the roots of tradition. But what do we know of Oxford's origins? Well, it dates back to 1096, right along with the event that represents very likely the single biggest epochal moment in the last 1,000 years of the world, and certainly of the West, the Crusades. The wars between the existing Old World Eastern empires, Arabic, Islamic, also Roman in the East, and a Western, lowercase, not capital W, region of the world that for many who are Greco-Roman adherents represented the Dark Ages. After the Roman Empire collapsed in 500 AD, the Roman and Greek classics were lost for centuries. And so people thought of that as the Dark Ages because that scholarship was not circulating. The Crusades toppled the East and gave birth to the rise of the New World, the West, capital W, and tradition, Oxford, and so on. And what I've shown here in this PowerPoint is what are some of the other events that are happening in the world in 1096. And it took me some time to put this together because apparently it's not very easy, it's not very important for people using English to know what's happening in the past, and certainly what's happening before the rise of the West. And so it's of interest to me to know what's happening in other parts of the world, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in India, what's happening in China, what's happening in Japan, what's happening in South America, as we call them today, what's happening in Thailand. There is, as you can see on the far right, there is a province that is also leaving a very important impression in the world. So many wonderful things are happening. The human is all of this, not just one great or glorious tradition. Now, how did this happen with the Crusades in overturning all this? Well, according to the scholarship, the Crusades, those knights that went to the East, they brought back these Greek and Roman language, Latin and Greek translations, some of it being in Arabic, and they brought those back to the clerics there in Western Europe. And this is what triggered the rebirth of the Greco-Roman tradition in Western Europe. And it had been gone and absent for centuries. So again, this is a very important moment, the Crusades. Those books that were received by these clerics, though, represented a rather advanced knowledge that had been lost as well. So some of this, I argue, was misinterpreted and misapplied. Another way of thinking about this is that confronted with the traces of the human, this knowledge that comes from the ancient world, and some of Greek tradition, scholars have shown, was influenced by ancient Egypt or by ancient Persia. So you're literally talking about the world human coming down through even the Greek and the Roman tradition. Well, those clerics failed to realize that they had the human, capital H, there with them. And so errors were made, misjudgments, misinterpretations, miscalculations. So instead, perhaps out of fear and self-glorifying greed, they reduce this literature to tools of warfare and defense works, the castles that figure so prominently in tradition and in a lot of these medieval movies or fantasy movies, the early sciences that get started, alchemy, astronomy, and glorification of conquest in the name of God, primarily, and nations, and eventually in whiteness itself. This very likely is the renaissance of the humanities, the rebirth of Greco-Roman classical study in the West, and a 1,000-year tradition of mistakes, errors, and violence. So here are a few examples of those who were, I think, thinking about this particular moment. Walter Benjamin, he's the author of The Origin of German Tragic Drama, and he's a really important figure for the early part of the 20th century. A cultural studies critic, someone who understood the role of the Greco-Roman tradition in reincarnating, if you will, these old traditions of the past and reincarnating this exceptionalism and this glory. So he was very much against that kind of thing. Walter Benjamin, the eminent Jewish culture critic and anti-fascist intellectual, made the exact same argument about the modern West. Though himself highly learned as an essayist and writer, Benjamin cherished the non-written, the oral, cultural, and the spiritual human expression, and knew that the clerical interpretations of the ruins of ancient societies that inspired written studies led to grotesque mistakes that were enshrined in book form. Benjamin rejects the notion of the Dark Ages, okay? For there was plenty of sophisticated culture in Europe not contained in Greco-Roman classics. So he's valuing people and their oral traditions in Western Europe. Christian clerics misreading the ruins of, he thinks, Egyptian hieroglyphics and classical culture, and distrusting the common people's ability to confront the earliest rude world, use simple allegory, he argues, for moral fables to convey Christian principles. For Benjamin, allegory in this sense, Western, modern, arises out of Western subjectivity located in, quote, historical codification and extreme foreshortening of the historical perspective. And what that means is, by not reckoning with and appreciating the orality as the expression of the human, it became a very limited, a very narrow, dangerously narrow perspective on what humanity was. And so instead of humanity, it becomes just manatee, a very violent activity. Moving on, the framers and the founders, scholar Meyer Reinhold, in the Classic Pages, classical reading of 18th century Americans, realized that this kind of mistake was also made by the framers and founders of the United States during the Revolutionary War epic that I mentioned earlier. And this is what he writes at the very beginning of his book. Classical learning was swiftly naturalized on American soil, and in consequence, a fair number of colonial and revolutionary Americans was nurtured and molded by the humanistic tradition. But while adding nothing to the fund of classical learning, they plundered the classics liberally for the advantage of their own lives and the national good. They knew far less about the ancient world than we do today, but the learning they acquired, circumscribed though it was, affected their thought and action far more. And finally, my last example of how mistakes can be made comes from contemporary scholar Sarah E. Bond and an article that she published in 2017 called Why We Need to Start Seeing the Classical World in Color. And this is an article that put her in some danger, just as Benjamin was in danger as a Jew in Western Europe at the rise of the Nazis. Because white supremacists were so upset with her article that trolls went after her, okay? Why? She revealed the classics upheaving work of archaeologist Vincent Brinkman. Quote, modern technology has revealed an irrefutable, if unpopular, truth. Many of the statues, reliefs, and sarcophagi created in the ancient Western world were in fact painted, Bond says. White marble was not the default classical color of beauty after all. Imagine, if you will, all of the classically white art and architecture of our modern world, and especially of our Western world here in the United States and in Western Europe, and of our universities. Bond goes on to reveal that with the, quote, scientific revolution of the 18th century and the wedding of classification, mathematics, and aesthetics, born of the fetishization of white marble, came the elevation of the Apollo right here, of the Belvedere, a Roman marble copy of a Hellenistic bronze original, as the quintessence of beauty. Now, I do not mean to single out Oxford or Cambridge, Harvard, or even the classics, but to point out that, like the humanities, the idea of the university and college constitute received knowledge. We are not taught the historical and cultural factual origins. For example, on a bright and sunny day in 2015, my family was taken on a tour by a good friend, Chae Gyung-young, to South Korea's Junguk Prehistory Museum. An archaeologist, a person who respected my African-Americanness, Mr. Chae had taken us to various archaeological sites his team excavated there in South Korea. A wonderfully built structure, the Junguk Prehistory Museum traces the human odyssey out of East Africa to throughout the world to South Korea. A marvelous moment for me that was nevertheless quite sobering. Located at some considerable distance from Seoul, the very metropole in the center of South Korea, there was hardly anyone there. No busloads of South Korean whiz kids on field trips, no tour buses full of camera-clicking Korean retirees, no clusters of bright-eyed European tourists. Here was the modern human, the genetic link between myself and my Korean wife, a graduate with a top-notch humanities education and a Xerox, she always reminds me, memory when she was a child. Here was this link that we needed, and she had never encountered it before in all of her years. Now, I might be wrong, too sensitive, but here is a key fact. Today's South Korean kids, some of the best educated in the world, are not taught this. In the US, K-12 education features this as the evolution, Darwin versus creationism, God as creator debate. Now, you don't need evolution, by the way. If you start with a modern human's East African origin, 200,000 years ago, you don't really need to talk about chimps and gorillas and so forth. The African genesis is probably more threatening than Darwin. Many white American parents, Christian conservatives, fundamentalists, choose to homeschool their children instead of letting them learn of evolution. While homeschooling can be and is used for other very good reasons, the public schools do not go far enough and scar many minority kids. We homeschool our son for a year. This Christian-based homeschooling is intended to deny the human. Our current state of residence, Nebraska, has a very robust homeschooling climate and more interracial adoptions by these conservatives than any state I've ever lived in. The implications are clear. K-12 education and homeschooling especially feed into the humanities, making inhumane adults like those who stormed the US Capitol and are now engaged in extreme, undemocratic, unchristian, and pro-Trump inhumane behavior. There is an oft-quoted common sense saying, aphorism in English, about the need to know history, one of the bedrock disciplines of the humanities. quote, those who don't know the past are doomed to repeat it. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is credited with it by some, but the actual source is Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana in The Life of Reason, The Phases of Human Progress, a 5-volume work published between 1905 and 1906, which is about reason in various fields and the progression of human reason. The actual and full quote from Volume 1, Reason and Common Sense, is this: progress, far from consisting in change, depends on retentativeness. When change is absolute, there remains no being to improve and no direction is set for possible improvement. And when experience is not retained, as among savages, infancy is perpetual. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, end quote. Now, there are many things to admire about Santayana. He was educated in the US at Harvard, where he taught then as a professor in the philosophy department and taught some of the very enlightened individuals, one of them being W.B. Du Bois, who is a co-founder of the US's leading civil rights organization, the NAACP. He saw the danger inherent in Germany's pre-Nazi philosophy. He wrote a 1915 book about this. He lived a relatively humble life despite his intellect when he had opportunity to make a lot more money. He was a principled atheist. However, his absolute belief in progressive rationality fixed him in human superiority. Racial superiority and eugenics are things that he believed in. Santayana's full thought, which you see here again, when experience is not retained as among savages, infancy is perpetual. Now think about that for a moment. It's the idea that those who use orality have no ability to retain knowledge. They cannot build a storehouse of understanding. That's a very limited and a very dangerous understanding of the way that the world works. So here's a guy who was critical of the trends in German philosophical development, who nevertheless has this kind of thinking about what the human is. Now, he's not to be blamed, but I just want to point out what kind of mistakes can be made by someone who's thinking in this manner. It does extreme damage. In other words, Santayana has no mental space to recognize that the modern human, dating back 200,000 or so years, already had our brain capacity. They already had our brain capacity. A major unappreciation by Santayana. At the same time, he overestimates modern humans. And just think about what we're doing right now in the world and how people are behaving in, say, Brazil or in India. And you then have to question whether humans really have evolved to the point where we have high capacity for reason in the fullest and complete sense. This is the violent humanities tradition lying behind the cliche, those who don't know the past are doomed to repeat it. A better, simpler aphorism might be, those who don't know the human are doomed. Now, I'm going to stop right here because I want to give you plenty of time to ask questions so that we can talk. Thank you for your attention. This has been really good for me, and I look forward to answering your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Rutledge, for your stimulating discussion on the deep reflection of humanities and that of humans through the lenses of literature, race, and critical race theory. And humanities, despite the pandemic, is indeed a salient discipline of inquiry, as it does not only unveil values, belief systems, and issues embedded in society, but also provide us ways to reconstructing knowledge and reopening the vast issues and discuss it by looking into its historical roots and looking at it and how it confronts us today. So thank you so much. So for today, we're now opening the floor for questions. And we would also like to acknowledge Professor Adam Glass. He's with us today.
How
Hello,
do you do,
good
sir? It's a
morning.
pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure
Hi,
to
Adam.
meet you too. Hi, hello. Thanks for having me here. I was a bit late. It's early morning here in Poland, and I miscalculated the time difference.
Thank you so
I was
much.
able to join you.
We appreciate that already, Adam.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to join you.
Yeah, Greg,
In
this is
fact,
Professor Glass, and he's my friend from Poland, and he's in cultural linguistics.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
He presented his paper on translation and on culture and translation.
Mhm. Wow. Well, that's quite important to my talk about the human as well, and the need to find a way of bridging these kinds of cultural divides, these linguistic divides. So the better understanding of the human and the use of interdisciplinarity is so very important for constructing the kind of educational model that I'm suggesting here in this talk. I cut out a portion of the talk because I wanted to allow for more discussion, but I do want to say that I do have an idea for how to approach and use this idea of reconstructing the human and escaping the kind of classical approach that we have used. For example, when I teach the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which came up a couple of times in the talk, it becomes very apparent that it's almost impossible to teach a novel like this. Any novel that really is meant to plumb the very depths of a culture and touch on the many different aspects of what the underlying dynamic and the underlying problems that are plaguing a given society at the time. Twain uses British culture. He uses Shakespeare. He uses orality. He uses African-American storytelling tradition. He uses romantic literature. He uses the Bible. He uses history. He's using economics. He's using law. He's using knowledge of geography and also maritime trade, because he was also a riverboat captain. So imagine if you're trying to teach that novel, as I do myself just a few weeks ago, and you have all of this knowledge, all of this history, all of this culture that's interacting in this novel, and it's just one person. It's impossible for you to really construct the human and let the students meditate significantly on the kinds of knowledges that they need to bring to bear to understand what Twain's real implication is. And so instead of 1 week, some graduate classes, they'll read it in a couple of days and then you're done. Or an undergraduate class like mine, where we read it for 2 weeks, you can't really understand what the human is as Twain saw it in 1870s and 1880s America. And he was looking back on the 1830s and 1840s period. So what I would like to do, if I could, would be to have a team of scholars, and we would work to teach this novel over an extended period. So yes, we would read it as literature, but I would bring in someone who's a historian who knows about the economics of the period, who knows about the legal traditions of the period, who knows about the linguistic traditions, because he uses quite a few dialects and they're interacting in the novel, who knows about the religious traditions of the period as well, the histories and the cultural matrices of the era, because all of that needs to be brought to bear. And then the students are going to understand how all of these pieces are connected. And so when they write their papers or they take tests, they then understand the full complexity of that interactive dynamic. And that's what I mean by the human. It's all those things brought to bear. And then you look at the text, and then you understand what Twain, an anti-imperialist, was trying to do and why he was doing it. If you just read it as literature, it's very flat, and you're going to have significant distortions. So I wanted to say that.
Exactly. Okay, now that you actually mentioned my name, I might have a comment to that. Yeah. Okay. Not so much a question as a comment. When you talked about the problems that critical race theory is now facing in the US, that brought to mind our own situation here in Poland. We've had for the last 5 or 6 years, we've had this rather conservative right-wing government with a lot of political propaganda going on and a lot of culture wars, so to speak. There's always this figure of the enemy lurking behind and trying to subvert the system, so we must defend ourselves. That's the official propaganda, and it's been very troubling. And so they've been looking at for a number of enemies. It was the refugee, it was this and that, and very recently it became the sexual minorities, the LGBT people, the homosexual people, and so on and so forth. And so now in the academia, if you do gender studies, gender is a buzzword. Gender studies is not very welcome. Maybe there's no official ban, there's nothing, no one would officially say we're not going to do this. But there are all kinds of ways that they can use to discourage you from doing it. There's a whole system of funding. If you have a project on gender studies, then you're not very likely to receive any funding for it, or very limited funding. If you teach gender studies, then there are all kinds of mechanisms that work behind the scenes. So it's kind of a soft, but other than that, a very effective way of telling people what is right, what is wrong, in the sense of targeting or framing your research and your teaching. So I was struck by the similarity, the parallelism between our situations, which on many other levels are very different. But somehow these mechanisms seem to be working along similar lines, no matter where, which is a troubling thing.
Isn't it? It's an interesting thing that the success of Obama seems to have been a trigger for much of this reactionary mode that the world is in. And I think it's almost impossible for us, and people who are doing kind of work that you're doing, these kinds of interstitial, interethnic ways of looking at linguistic, looking at the interaction of cultures, looking at the way that the humanities is configured, is the best way of trying to deal with competing ideologies, because you get the idea of diversity and progress. It is, you say, the buzzword for gender studies, that also becomes this kind of positive buzzword that gets replicated by administrators, whether you're talking about chairs of departments or deans or so forth. But at the same time, you then have no ability to get the kind of funding, and you don't get access to the fullest extent of the knowledge and the resources that you need to make the linkages and to pursue the kind of material questions that you need to deal with, and the conflicting ideologies that underlie and are just beneath the surface. And so, as someone here in the United States, when I was teaching and Obama won, I actually had two conflicting ideas at that very moment. because the way that many Americans responded to Obama's election, I'm talking about minorities. And yes, you had a significant portion of the majority population that voted for him, but there was kind of a glorification. And that really troubled me because what I thought it represented was this kind of exceptionalism. And that signaled that we're still performing the same kind of dynamic, but it just had a different face that seemed to be more acceptable to the independents, to the suburban population. The problem is, because of neoliberalism and the way that exceptionalism interfaces with it, you don't really have a lot of deeply rooted foundation to critique what's really going on behind the scenes. And so it wasn't a surprise for me that the Obama administration unfolded the way that it did. Well, what's really troubling is that even though he was pretty much middle of the road as a neoliberal and not really progressive, nevertheless, the backlash against him here in the United States and around the world has simply been unbelievable. It has unleashed upon the world something that is this plague that we are dealing with. And the ideological plague is the worst kind of thing that we're dealing with. But the amount of wealth that we're seeing right now, the prospect that Jeff Bezos of Amazon could become the world's first trillionaire. When I heard that a few days ago, it was, and I've been afraid and thinking about this accumulation of wealth for weeks now as new slavery. But when I heard that we might have our first trillionaire in the world, it's a really, really scary thing. And this is a reaction to Obama's progressive election. So things that really decayed rather quickly. I don't know what to make of it because you have too many problems that it created.
What do you think might have been? I mean, if this is, but this is, in fact, when you say that the way his administration kind of came to an end was not surprising to you. It was surprising to me, but of course I look at the United States from the outside, from rather far away. I've been to the country a few times, but I don't know it very well. So my understanding was that back then, when he was elected, and for the second term too, then you would think, okay, finally we can begin to think that the times of slavery are finally over. You know, that we have a black president of the United States, and it wasn't an accident because he was re-elected. So it wasn't just a one-off. So now we can hope for a female president. We can hope for an Asian president,
a gay
Asian
president?
female president,
Yeah.
a gay president, whatever. And this didn't happen. I mean, it has only recently happened with Joe Biden in a way, and his administration, which is probably the most diverse ever in American history. But you know, the Trump story is, I mean, that was very, I mean, it wasn't surprising in the sense I knew that these things, of course, were going on, and they exist. But I never expected that they'll become so powerful and so dominating to the extent of Trump being actually elected. When I see it as the previous elections, 2016, I see it as an opportunity missed on the part of the American people when you came so close to electing the first female president. I mean, this would have made history, right? No matter what you think of Hillary Clinton, I mean, of course, there are pros and cons. Of course, you may not like her as a person and so on and so forth. But the very fact, in the symbolic sense, and yet that didn't happen. So it was very, very, very troubling for people from the outside as well to see that happen or not happen.
There is another backstory to this that relates to my reference to the 1960s earlier in the talk. And I showed the image of riots in LA, the Watts riots of the mid-1960s. Part of what happened with the results of the 1960s and the civil rights progress of African Americans, gender rights that came online, Native American rights, you had these literary movements and cultural movements that had their day. And because of their ability to use the media at the time, they were able to leverage that and to make changes in colleges and universities. That set in motion actually a kind of underground backlash as very wealthy people saw what was happening and began to coordinate with one another and have their own kinds of private meetings and retreats. So what we're seeing now is actually something that's been building since the 1960s. And it just so happens that Obama's success triggered maybe the escalation of that, and the factor of Trump being there just by happenstance, combined with the way that these ultra wealthy, ultra conservative elites and the way that the university system has worked. All these things have combined together to then create this perfect storm that resulted in where we are right now. And it's just too many long simmering problems, too many deficiencies in our educational system in particular. And I do mean to say, I have not studied the human, and it's a real deficit for me. I've been in my own life since I left graduate school and doing my own kind of research, been much more curious about other parts of the world, other dynasties and kingdoms that existed in other periods that I never learned about. And I consider myself to be remarkably deprived in that regard, because it means that the way that I look at the past was really left in the most narrow terms. And had I known about this earlier, I might have made different decisions and had a different life course. I might not have gone to law school. I might have gone directly to grad school. Some of the things that I read over the years, I would have been much more interested in studying these things instead of going to law school, because I sought to be a civil rights attorney at the time. So it was that kind of very narrow, you're going to be a legal warrior for justice approach. But there are a lot of faults and weaknesses in that particular narrow approach.
Right. Do you think, Professor, the education has actually been changing over the past decades? And as you have observed, that neoliberalism has actually impacted education, primarily on curriculum, instruction. And as far as I remember, like in 2013, the Philippines, for example, has adopted a particular curriculum that seeks to create a particular mold of students, a particular model that the industry requires, or that the industry demands. And for me, it's more of a neoliberal way of education. So, for example, in the humanities or in the social sciences, instead of allowing people to get into a deeper thinking, analytical and critical thinking, there have been ways into which they should think. Like there's already molds for them. And I think that defeats the purpose, or that is a little bit of disservice to the humanities and the social sciences. So how does that, how is it in the US though? Is it also similar?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. You combine what you just talked about, which seems to be a global trend, right? With the defunding of the humanities, with the refusal of a lot of the deans to replace people who are retiring. This is what's been happening in my department. So you get a narrower pool of faculty members who are tasked with doing more work, and the expectations keep on going up. And this also has been happening, of course, in the K through 12 education, because the funding has not been sufficiently supported, because a lot of the tax dollars that should be flowing into the government coffers are not being paid by the corporations. Or in the United States, not only are those tax dollars not going into the public sector, but the tax dollars that we are paying goes into the military industrial complex. So you have an emptying out of the center, and it's only this bare bones, as you said, quite correctly, this bare bones education to create, for the most part, a population that's going to be a population of consumers. I had mentioned before my disappointment about public schools, and that we homeschooled our son for 1 year. We've seen in some of our son's homework math mistakes. We've seen grammatical errors. And these things were occurring with the kind of regularity that makes you cringe and really worry about what's happening and what kind of education that these kids are receiving. And I don't for a moment think that it's accidental. I think this is a very, very intentional design. Now, the teachers might not be intentionally part of the system, but the idea of defunding the system and not having a fully enriched experience for those students. People have known for decades. A lot of American scholarship dating back to the 30s, 40s is used in places like Finland, because it was very good scholarship and people understood what worked. We're just not using it. So that's a very intentional design that, well, the plagued humanities is the plagued sense of the human. Many people are simply not as human as they ought to be. And that's really scary for the world.
Right. And I think, like, if we're going to look at it at the faculty lens, there are several issues that concern it. For example, the publish and perish practice in universities. Another is, like, I mean, because of the publish and perish, the predatory journals really, increased tremendously. And the thing is that a lot of faculty members are aware that they're predatory, but because of the requirement for them to keep their jobs, they tend to, take risks. And I think this is quite a problem, because if I'm not saying that it's completely bad, what I'm saying is it kind of disservice in a way, because, for example, apart from research publication, textbook publication, there are several textbooks that I've seen, for example, in my context in the Philippines, are just like copied and pasted. Like, they are not well, as you mentioned, they are not screened. I remember one time when I was asked to attend one of our visiting professors, Dr. Willie, when he asked us to examine a textbook. And when we examine a textbook, we have to look at a particular theory in which the textbook is anchored on. And I thought that, I think it's not working in the text that I'm reading, because some of them are just like copy and pasting because of the memorandum provided by the Department of Education, the Commission of Higher Education, and that becomes quite a challenge. A challenge not just because of the content, but also of the time provided to them. So I think these are all, if not direct effect, but could be a residue of this neoliberal trend that is being adopted in the university or in education in general.
And one of the things too, just to focus on the graduate seminar, and one of the things that I am trying to work against, and I talked about close reading of text, what I've tried to do over the last 10 years or so is that, especially for the undergraduate students, but also in my graduate classes, is to reduce the amount of reading so that the students can actually have a deeper, closer sense of the textuality. My approach, and you may be able to echo this, Narada, in graduate school there in UW-Madison, you're expected to read huge amounts of material. And it's the idea of the speed reader that you can just absorb through your heightened intellectual capacity all of the plot, the characters, and then the complexities of irony that lie beneath the surface. And that's simply impossible. So you're going to get bad results for a host of reasons. Graduate students who are overtaxed, faculty members who are overtaxed and who, to keep current, are using theories and recycling or invoking theories rather rapidly. And what gets lost is the story. What gets lost is especially the human. So I recall a couple of times in my grad school career where we read text certain ways, and there are problematic ways of reading the text. So I think by slowing things down, you'll give a richer education to the grad students, but you also will give a richer opportunity for the faculty and reduce their burden. And you get better teaching that way, and you build up a more solid foundation. And you can address these other issues that you otherwise can't because you're on this Fordist factory belt. Everyone is rushing, and no one quite knows where the train is heading as it speeds toward this cliff.
Yeah, I think
also
that
think
the
that-
trend is similar all over the world because we're rushing here too in Thailand. Adam?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, with education, when you say that this is something that must be or might be ingrained in the system, my impression is also that we are experiencing kind of a backlash from technology. This modern, wonderful technology we're using, thanks to which we are, we can communicate. Now during the pandemic, we can meet and everything, and so on. This is really wonderful. But then with the internet, with Google, with Wikipedia, and so on, all of this is wonderful stuff. Mm-hmm. But then it backfires because kids themselves, I can see it in my kids, they have this attitude of not forcing themselves to remember things because it's all there. Mm-hmm. They have a smartphone and they can access any information they need in a few clicks. Why remember? Why remember the names? Why remember the dates? Why remember how to calculate things when you have your calculator? Okay, I mean, and what can I say? I mean, I feel helpless. I mean, of course I tell them, look, it's not about, I mean, imagine a situation where you're left without it. What would you do without your smartphone, or when there's no internet around? The internet connection is cut off, and then where are you? Okay, but that doesn't really appeal to them. And if you tell them, okay, it's not really about this whole thing is about being able to do things, being effective. Mm-hmm. You need to be effective as an accountant. Mm-hmm. as a banker, even as a teacher, as a humanist, you need to be effective. You need to be able to process the information, to channel the information. But it hardly matters what's there in your brain, what's there in your mind, and how you understand things. Mm-hmm. So that's what I tell my kids. I tell them, look, it's about you. It's not about what you can do, but about who you are. You learn these things, you will forget 90% of them. No problem. That's the way our brain works. I right now at this age, I have forgotten most of the things I've learned at school, but that wasn't useless. It had a purpose. You go through the process. You train yourself. You learn how to look at things, and so on and so forth. But these are abstract things. At school age, kids don't really. I mean, we can look back and appreciate the kind of education that we've had, or we can see the gaps, things that we missed, and so on. I mean, you cannot really expect kids to understand that at their age, and it's on the educational system to do the job for them, and it is not doing that, and it's not doing it in Poland, and from what you say, it's not doing this in the United States either. So that is troubling. But also the speed reading thing, I think it's also about effectiveness. You've got a document, you've got something that you read for information. You have to learn how to skim and scan to get the gist of it, and so on. You lose the story and you lose the pleasure. You lose the pleasure as well. I mean, it's like speed reading is like speed ice cream eating. You've got a bowl of ice cream right in front of you. You don't just gobble on it, and you don't measure your time. You take the time. You appreciate the flavor and everything.
Yeah.
With speed reading, nothing of this happens.
Speed ice cream eating.
And all you remember is it's cold, but not the flavor of the ice cream anymore, or the taste.
Yeah, what it's called? Yeah, I think Greg mentioned that in our last conversation about technology, the dark side and the good side about technology. Yeah, I no longer remember telephone numbers.
But my story as well. Yes, I used to remember something like 15, 20 phone numbers to people I regularly contacted with. No problem.
I could do more than that.
Yeah, and it wasn't. I didn't feel it was a burden. I mean, it didn't overburden my memory. It was just a natural thing. Right now, I can only remember my own number because I give it to people. I don't even remember my wife's number because it's a name. My wife is a name on the telephone. I don't dial this number. It's crazy. I will have to consciously actually learn it, make a point of it.
Yeah, we're old people. You'll have to adapt, or we have to adapt yourself to your son. For me, to my nephew. Yeah, he's on the phone most of the time.
And there's also with the use of technology here in my son's school system, they have started using Chromebooks as their instructional tool, and they have phased out, except for some of the classes, their published textbooks. And this happened beginning when my son was in the 6th grade. And it troubled me greatly because you had this arrival of this very fancy technology, and they did not have a class, which I do not understand why this would happen, except that it's intentional. They did not have a class that was for the students to understand that the internet is a lawless place, and that these kinds of activities of using the internet and interfacing with the internet comes at very decisive risk. And so you have to understand that research and being able to weigh different sources and to understand that there is a serious limit to what you can find on the internet. That's not taught them. It's not taught them. And so it's simply, well, turn on your laptop, open up your Chromebook, and find this. And there's so little guidance from the teachers. So the students are finding these different articles, and then they're putting together their reports, for example, instead of everyone reading the same article and then being guided by the teacher into how you read that. What are the merits of this? How is it transitioning from the introduction to the literature review or whatever? That's not being done. And
the teacher doesn't know either.
It's really troubling, Narada. And I've been so unhappy about this. And my son he's had to listen to me gripe and be very unhappy and have a lot of unhappy facial expressions when I know that certain things are happening in his classes. And it's hard for our relationship as a result of that, or it's harder for our relationship because dad is out of date, right?
Yeah, I think we'll have to find another talk next time so that we can talk about the impact of the internet to study, to literacy these days.
Here.
Yeah. It's really nice. It's
Right.
been really nice talking to you too from different continents. Well, I think we've been doing it quite a while, and Joey and I will have to continue to our seminar class.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Right.
That's right.
Well, thank
There's
you
just one more
so
thing, if I may, just one the final word. Greg, thank you very much for bringing in the figure of this Vietnamese writer, Viet Thanh Nguyen. I've got this book here with it's not the sympathizer, it's a collection of stories
Yes.
called The Refugees. I think he wrote that later. I think it's a later book. It's a collection of stories. I just want to share it with you. I mean, many of you probably know it. If you don't, I highly recommend. It's not a very easy reading emotionally. These are very powerful stories of Vietnamese refugees. But he's a magnificent writer.
He has a sequel to The Sympathizer that was just published a few days ago.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yep.
I need to get hold of this. Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. What
Thank
time
you.
is it?
Right now it's 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock in the morning.
Okay. Well,
Oh.
is it Saturday or Friday?
It's Friday, I think. Yeah,
Oh.
it's Friday.
I'm sorry
Friday.
for that. Do you have to go to work? Thank you so much for participating in our
Thank you.
here. And well,
Thank you all. Thank you all.
You see, what you share is valuable, but well, you can see that the topic is quite a serious topic, and well, and I really enjoyed it, and I think many of us who attended here, they're like those who are really interested in what's going on in the U.S. and especially the situation of ethnicity there.
Well, thank you for setting this up again, Narada, and thank you for your help, Joy. It's really been a good opportunity for me to have this international moment. This is the human as I wish to see it configured, and I think this is the way. If we're going to save ourselves, we have to be able to reach to Thailand, to Poland, to Africa, to all the parts of the world. Otherwise, something very bad is going to happen. So this is very important. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's been very good for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and please give my regards to Jonglim and Mark.
I certainly will.
Thank you, attending at Thai, so much for joining us.
Thank you for letting me and our students join. Thank you.
We have Thai translators here, our interpreters here. We want to train our students, and so we have like synchronized translation here. This time, the first time.
First time.
Yeah, we're gonna try doing it more with the Thai version. And next time your talks will be, Adam, next time your talk will be in Thai too.
Great. Fantastic.
All right. Thank you so much. And good morning. Good night, Greg. Okay, thanks, Joey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.